Have you ever noticed that some men seem to leave a lasting impression on women without trying nearly as hard as everyone else? They are not always the richest, they are not always the most handsome, they are not always the most successful man in the room, and yet women think about them long after the conversation ends. They remember them, they wonder about them, sometimes they become deeply attached to them. Meanwhile, other men appear to have everything society says should make them attractive: status, money, achievements, confidence on the surface. Yet they struggle to create the same emotional impact. Why? What is the difference? What causes one man to be easily forgotten while another becomes almost impossible to ignore? Most people assume the answer is appearance, status, or social skills. But that explanation falls apart the moment you look at real life, because we have all seen ordinary men inspire extraordinary levels of attraction, and we have all seen highly accomplished men who leave almost no emotional imprint at all. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." In other words, who you are internally eventually shapes how others experience you externally. And that idea may explain far more about attraction than most people realize. Because women do not become emotionally attached to a man simply because of what he owns, what he earns, or what he achieves. More often, they become attached to how he makes them feel, how he carries himself, and the psychological experience of being around him. In this video, we'll explore the hidden psychological mechanisms that make certain men unforgettable to women. We'll examine why validation often destroys attraction, why emotional independence increases investment, why presence creates deeper connection, and why the men women become most attached to are often the men who do not desperately seek attachment in return. Once you understand these principles, you'll begin to see attraction very differently, not as a game of impressing people, but as a process that begins deep within the mind. Factor number 1. Don't need her validation. Most men believe attraction grows when a woman approves of them, so they spend their time trying to impress, persuade, or prove themselves worthy of attention. They carefully choose their words, they seek positive reactions, they look for signs that they are being liked. And without realizing it, they hand over something incredibly valuable: their sense of worth. Because the moment a man's confidence depends on a woman's approval, she gains influence over his emotional state. His mood rises when she responds, his mood drops when she becomes distant, and that dynamic is easier to detect than most men realize. People are remarkably sensitive to neediness. They can feel when someone wants something from them. They can feel when someone's behavior is quietly shaped by the desire to be accepted. That is why seeking validation often has the opposite effect of what men intend. Instead of creating attraction, it can reduce it, because approval loses value when it feels necessary. Seneca once wrote, "He who seeks approval from others makes himself their prisoner." What he meant is that when your self-worth depends on someone else's judgment, you no longer control it yourself. And that is exactly where many men go wrong. The men women become most curious about are often not the men trying hardest to gain approval. They're the men who seem comfortable whether approval comes or not. They appreciate attention, but they do not depend on it. They enjoy connection, but they do not chase validation. And that difference creates a powerful psychological effect. Because when a woman realizes that her approval is not controlling a man's behavior, a new question begins to form in her mind. What gives him that level of certainty? Why does he seem unaffected by things that influence so many other men? Where does that confidence come from? And that is where attraction often begins. Not with certainty, with curiosity. The human mind naturally returns to things it does not immediately understand. It replays them, examines them, thinks about them long after the moment has passed. And the more attention something occupies in the mind, the more emotionally significant it becomes. This is the first trigger in the process. Before a woman becomes emotionally invested in a man, she usually becomes mentally interested in him. She starts paying attention, and attention is where every deeper form of attraction begins. But curiosity alone is never enough, because getting a woman's attention and keeping it are two very different things. The next step happens when curiosity turns into something far more personal, an emotional connection she rarely experiences with other people. Factor number 2, make her feel seen. Curiosity may capture a woman's attention, but attention alone does not create emotional investment. For that to happen, she has to feel something deeper. She has to feel understood. And in today's world, that experience is surprisingly rare. Most people spend conversations waiting for their turn to speak. They listen just enough to respond. They focus on being interesting rather than being interested. As a result, very few people ever feel truly seen. Very few people feel that someone is fully present with them. Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we may listen twice as much as we speak." At first glance, it sounds like advice about communication, but it points to something much deeper. Real listening is not simply hearing words. It is paying attention to emotions. It is noticing what someone means, not just what they say. It is being present enough to understand the person behind the conversation. And when a man develops that ability, the entire interaction changes. Instead of feeling judged, a woman feels accepted. Instead of feeling analyzed, she feels understood. Instead of feeling like she has to perform, she feels comfortable being herself. That emotional experience leaves a lasting impression, because people rarely remember every detail of a conversation, but they remember how they felt during it. They remember who made them feel safe, who made them feel understood, who made them feel seen. And once a woman begins associating those feelings with a particular man, her attention starts returning to him more frequently. She thinks about previous conversations. She remembers small moments. She replays things he said, not because he used a technique, not because he tried to impress her, but because he created an emotional experience that feels increasingly rare. This is where attraction starts moving beyond curiosity, because curiosity makes a woman notice a man, but emotional connection makes her remember him. And the more often her mind returns to him, the more emotional energy she begins investing. That investment matters, because attraction deepens wherever attention and emotional energy are repeatedly directed. In other words, the moment a woman feels genuinely understood, she's no longer simply curious about a man, she's beginning to feel connected to him. And connection is what transforms passing interest into something much harder to ignore. But emotional connection alone still does not create obsession. For emotional investment to grow even deeper, something else has to happen. She has to realize that this man's emotional stability does not depend on her presence.
Factor number 3, be willing to walk away. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in attraction is this. Most men think that holding on tighter increases the chance of keeping a woman interested. So when they feel a connection forming, they start to protect it. They text more often. They try to maintain momentum. They become more available than they normally would. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to signal dependence. Because their emotional state starts to revolve around whether the connection continues or not. And that is where the dynamic begins to shift. A man who is trying to preserve an outcome is no longer operating from strength. He is operating from fear of loss. And people are extremely sensitive to that shift. Because when a man behaves as if he needs something to continue, it changes how that interaction is perceived. It stops feeling like choice and starts feeling like pressure. Bruce Lee once said, "The less you care, the stronger you become." What this is pointing to is not emotional coldness, it is emotional independence. The ability to remain grounded even when the outcome is uncertain. When a woman senses that a man is not emotionally dependent on her presence, something subtle happens. She no longer sees him as someone trying to hold on. She sees him as someone who could stay or leave and still be fine either way. And that perception changes everything. Because most people are used to being pursued in one direction. They are used to people trying to secure their attention. They are used to being emotionally needed. But very few people experience the opposite dynamic. Someone who is present, interested, but not attached to the outcome. Someone who enjoys the interaction, but does not depend on it continuing. And that creates a shift in her attention. Instead of him constantly investing in keeping the connection alive, she begins investing more energy into maintaining it herself. Instead of him chasing clarity, she starts trying to understand where she stands. Instead of him fearing loss, he becomes the one capable of accepting it. And that is where emotional investment begins to deepen. Because attraction is not just about who shows interest, it is about who becomes psychologically significant enough to think about. And the moment a man proves that he is willing to walk away rather than compromise his self-respect, he stops being just another option in her mind. He becomes something else entirely. Someone who is not held in place by fear, but by choice.
Factor number 4. How she sees your value. At this stage of attraction, something subtle begins to happen. It is no longer just about curiosity or emotional connection. It becomes about how she interprets your value in her mind. Most men assume value is fixed, that it is determined by money, appearance, or external success. But in reality, value is not experienced directly. It is interpreted. And that interpretation is constantly shaped by how a man carries himself internally. When a man's confidence depends on external validation, his behavior becomes reactive. He adjusts based on how he is being perceived. He seeks signals that confirm he is doing well, and this creates instability in how he is experienced. Bruce Lee once said, "The successful warrior is the average man with laser-like focus." What this points to is internal direction. A man who is internally stable does not shift his energy based on external feedback. He does not become more confident when he is approved of or less confident when he is ignored. He remains consistent. And consistency changes perception. Because when a woman interacts with a man whose emotional state does not fluctuate based on her reactions, her mind begins to recalibrate how she understands him. He no longer feels like someone who is trying to prove his value. He feels like someone who already operates from it. And this creates a psychological shift. She stops evaluating him through obvious external markers alone and starts paying attention to something deeper: his steadiness, his emotional control, his lack of need for constant reassurance. And over time, those signals begin to reshape how she assigns value to him internally. Because humans do not evaluate value in isolation. We evaluate it relative to behavior, presence, and emotional stability. And when a man appears internally grounded while remaining unaffected by external validation, he begins to occupy a different category in her mind. Not because he is trying to be seen as valuable, but because he behaves as if his value is already established. And that distinction is what changes everything. Because once a woman recalibrates how she sees a man's value, her emotional investment begins to shift accordingly. She starts paying attention. She starts attaching more meaning to his actions, and she starts wondering what makes him different from everyone else she has met. And that is where deeper attraction begins to form. Not from what he has, but from how he is perceived to exist in his own internal frame.
Factor number 5. Hard to replace. At this point, she is no longer just passively noticing you. She is paying attention in a way that feels more automatic than intentional. Your presence has already started taking up mental space. But this is exactly where most men make a critical mistake. Because when they sense distance, uncertainty, or reduced responsiveness, they try to correct it. They increase effort. They become more available. They try to restore the previous level of engagement, and in doing so, they unintentionally erase what made them stand out in the first place. Because the moment behavior becomes predictable, it stops creating psychological tension. And without tension, there's nothing for the mind to hold on to over time. Carl Jung once pointed out, "What you resist persists." But in attraction dynamics, the principle works slightly differently. What cannot be easily predicted becomes what the mind returns to again and again. When a man does not shift his emotional state based on her reactions, he stops fitting into the usual pattern she is used to experiencing. He doesn't overreact when attention drops. He doesn't overinvest when attention increases. He remains emotionally consistent regardless of fluctuation. And that consistency creates a contrast, because most men unconsciously operate on a cycle of reaction and reassurance. They adjust their behavior based on feedback. They escalate when things feel uncertain. They stabilize only when they receive validation. But when a man does not participate in that cycle, the pattern breaks. And anything that breaks a pattern becomes mentally significant. She starts noticing the difference between him and everyone else she interacts with. She remembers how he did not react the way others would. She replays moments where his behavior did not follow expectation. And over time, that contrast creates a psychological anchor in her mind. He is no longer just another person in her experience. He becomes a reference point, a standard she uses even unconsciously to evaluate others. And that's what it means to become hard to replace. Not because he's trying to stand out, but because his behavior does not blend into the pattern she is used to. Factor number 6. She starts chasing your attention. Once a man becomes hard to replace, attraction begins to turn into pursuit. Because at this point, he's no longer experienced as just another presence in her environment. He becomes a reference point in her mind. And when that happens, attention stops being passive. It starts becoming emotionally charged. She notices when he is not as available as before. She pays attention to response timing. She becomes aware of gaps that she would normally ignore. And those small gaps start to feel more significant than the actual conversations themselves. Most men assume attraction is maintained by increasing effort, more messages, more availability, more reassurance. But in reality, over-availability removes psychological tension. And without tension, attention loses depth. Jordan Peterson once said, "If you don't say what you think, you kill your authentic self." In social dynamics, this reflects something deeper. When behavior becomes too predictable, it stops creating mental engagement. The mind does not engage deeply with what it can fully anticipate. So when a man does not follow the expected pattern of constant response and emotional adjustment, something shifts. She starts filling in the gaps herself. She starts paying closer attention to his absence, not just his presence. She starts interpreting small changes in behavior more deeply than before.
And slowly, attention stops flowing in one direction. It becomes something she actively participates in maintaining. She reaches out first more often. She extends conversations beyond what is necessary. She creates reasons to stay connected even when none are required. Not because she is told to, but because uncertainty creates mental engagement. And when someone becomes mentally significant but not fully predictable, the mind does not disengage. It invests more attention to resolve the gap. And this is where the reversal happens. The man is no longer the one actively maintaining emotional momentum. He becomes the one setting the reference point, and she becomes the one adjusting her behavior to stay connected to it. That is what it means when attraction turns into pursuit, not through force, but through psychological rebalancing. Factor number 7, emotional fixation. Something changes here. It is no longer just curiosity. It is no longer even pursuit. It becomes emotional fixation. Because at this stage, the interaction is no longer being processed in real time. It is being processed in memory. She starts replaying conversations without trying to. She revisits small moments that didn't seem important at the time. She begins attaching meaning to details that previously felt neutral. And slowly, the experience stops being about what is happening now. It becomes about what has already happened. Carl Jung once observed, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." And some interactions don't end when the moment ends. They continue to reshape how the mind interprets them afterward. Because when something creates a strong emotional imprint, the mind does not file it away cleanly. It keeps returning to it, not because it chooses to, but because it is still trying to process it. And when a man is emotionally steady, not overly available, and not fully predictable, the mind cannot place him into a simple category. And what cannot be categorized is what the mind keeps revisiting. She starts thinking about him at random moments during the day. She connects certain feelings to unrelated situations that remind her of him. She feels a pull toward the connection even in his absence. And over time, his presence is no longer dependent on interaction. It is sustained internally. Because fixation is not created by more contact. It is created by lingering mental return. And once that happens, the cycle is complete. Curiosity turns into pursuit. Pursuit turns into emotional investment. And emotional investment turns into persistence in the mind. Not because it was forced, but because it was never fully resolved. Factor number 8. The emotional loop completes. The connection no longer depends on interaction. It depends on memory. And memory does not need physical presence to stay alive in the mind. Because once an emotional imprint has been created, the experience does not end when the interaction ends. It continues being processed internally. She is no longer responding to what is happening between you in real time. She is responding to what you represent in her memory. And that shift changes the entire structure of attraction. Most men assume interest fades when communication decreases, but in reality, when something has already created emotional weight, distance often does the opposite, because absence removes distraction, and what remains in absence is what the mind considers important enough to revisit. Without conscious effort, thoughts about you begin to appear without clear reason. Certain emotions reconnect her back to previous interactions automatically. And over time, these reactions stop feeling separate. They begin to form a continuous internal pattern. Carl Jung once noted, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And emotional fixation follows a similar structure. Once an experience moves deep enough into the unconscious, it no longer requires external reinforcement to remain active. It continues on its own. The mind replays it. It reinterprets it. It reconstructs it in different emotional contexts. And each return strengthens the imprint further. This is why certain people stay in the mind far longer than the actual time spent with them would suggest. Not because of how often they were present, but because of how strongly they were registered internally. And when that internal repetition begins, the loop no longer needs input from the outside world. Attraction is no longer created through interaction. It is maintained through memory activation. The mind keeps returning to the same emotional experience again and again, even in silence. Not because it is trying to, but because it was never fully closed. And what is never fully closed does not fade. It repeats.
Factor number 9, identity shift. At this stage, something deeper happens than emotional fixation. It is no longer just about remembering you. It is about how she begins to define you in her mind. Because when emotional loops repeat long enough, they stop being moments and start becoming interpretation. She is no longer asking, "What did he do?" She starts asking, "What kind of person is he?" And that is where attraction moves into identity formation. Most men think attraction is built through isolated interactions, good conversations, good chemistry, good timing. But the mind does not store people as isolated events. It stores them as patterns, and patterns eventually become identity labels. She starts associating you with a certain emotional feeling, not a single moment, but a consistent internal impression. And over time, that impression becomes more important than any specific interaction. Carl Jung once noted, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But in emotional perception, the opposite also happens. People become who they are consistently perceived to be. And once she starts assigning a stable internal identity to you, her behavior begins to align with that perception. She interacts differently, she responds differently, she invests differently. Because she is no longer reacting to moments, she is reacting to a defined image of you in her mind. And that is where emotional depth stabilizes. Not because more things are happening, but because fewer things are needed to trigger the same internal meaning. Attraction becomes less about what you do and more about what you are in her perception.
Final thought. How women get addicted to men. What you've just seen is not a set of tricks. It is a psychological pattern, a progression of how perception slowly turns into emotional attachment over time. It begins with curiosity, then connection, then investment, then a shift in how value is perceived. Then the moment a man becomes hard to replace, then pursuit begins, then emotional fixation, then identity formation, and finally emotional dependence built inside the mind. Each stage feeds the next one, not through intensity, but through repetition and interpretation. Because attraction is not created in one moment of effort. It is built through how consistently someone occupies mental space over time. And once that process starts, it no longer depends on constant interaction. It continues internally. So the real insight here is not about controlling women. It is about understanding how the mind assigns meaning, how behavior becomes perception, and how perception slowly becomes emotional attachment. Now step back for a moment and ask yourself this. Have you ever experienced someone becoming more significant in your mind without any clear reason why it happened? Or noticed how your feelings changed simply because the dynamic between you and someone else shifted? That is the part most people never consciously observe. But once you understand it, you start seeing patterns everywhere. not just in others, but in yourself as well. Thank you for watching Stoic Wisdom today. Leave a comment and share your thoughts on this. Have you ever experienced this kind of emotional shift before? I read every comment and I want to understand your perspective. And if you want more psychological breakdowns like this on attraction, behavior, and human dynamics, subscribe to our channel. Because once you understand the pattern, you stop being controlled by it. Until next time, stay calm, stay grounded, stay stoic.